Yep. Hello, guys. Welcome back. So, yeah, the last lecture that we had, we discussed on foodborne diseases, and in specific, I mentioned that we'll be talking about foodborne diseases in relevance to microorganisms. And beyond microorganisms, we would be discussing about protozoan infections through food, protozoal infections, helminthic infections. That's what I mentioned that I would be discussing about. Now, just to recap on what we discussed the previous lecture, we spoke on the how do we categorize the foodborne diseases into food chemical poisonings, into poisonings and infection. And poisonings, we have chemical poisonings and intoxication, we spoke about them. Then in infection, we spoke of invasiveness and being systemic and all that stuff. As far as the categorization of the foodborne diseases are concerned, so let me just yeah, this is what we discussed yesterday, the last lecture. Now I am going further ahead. Now we discussed on those categories, and then we came down to specifically bacterial foodborne diseases. And in the bacterial foodborne diseases, we categorize them into intoxications and infections. And then we further went about to discuss the individual cases of intoxication. What are the different types of intoxications? We spoke of them and the types of infections, and we ended up there. Now, going further ahead, today we will start with each of those bacterial foodborne infections and try to elaborate on them so that we get a clear picture. The whole idea is that it's not just for the students or the seeker who wants to know more on the subject. The seeker could be anybody, it could be consumers, or it could be anybody. As a matter of fact, anybody who's watching the video will definitely should be able to have some take back on the risk associated with consumption of unsafe food. So that's the whole idea, right? Now, coming back to the subject, now this is a simple tabulation that has been shown here, and let me tell you all, I ought to give credit to the source of the material that I'm showing right now here on the screen. This is taken from a book by name Food Microbiology, authored by William Frazier. Right, William Frazier and another author, I think it is Deathmouth. I don't exactly remember the name. I'll share you the image of the cover page of the book as well at the end of the lecture. Let me see if I can do that. And so this is a tabulation that I picked up from that text, and I picked it up because it was convenient, it was easy, and it is self-explanatory in a lot of sense. And I'm trying to use the tabulation here to explain the things. Yeah. Anyway, so let's understand the tabulation. So we have 5 columns here. Column 1 talks of the disease that is caused, and the etiological agent. The etiological agent here means the disease causing agent, the pathogenic organism that is causing the disease. We are referring to that. So the disease and the causative agent. And next comes incubation period, signs and symptoms. All right, now this is purely a medical terminology that we need to understand. Incubation period here, when I mention it, means the time period from the time infection actually happened. I remember mentioning what infection is. Infection is the very entry of microorganisms into your body is termed as infection. So from the time the infection happens till the time the symptoms start to show up. Like, so from the time infection has happened, so you may ingest a contaminated food right now, maybe, and maybe after 6 hours the symptoms show up. So the time period, 6 hours, 6 hours from now, that is called as incubation period. So that time is required for the symptom to show up. Now that's what we're talking about here, incubation period. Then comes signs and symptoms. Signs and symptoms, typical medical symptoms that we talk of, clinical observations, or generally the doctors, the symptoms that the doctor, the healthcare professionals would ask you. It refers to them. Then comes the next column, talks about the foods involved. What are the different types of food that mostly carry these disease causing agents? All right, so they've been categorized in most cases, they've been categorized here. And finally comes the control measures. How can we actually control the transmission of this particular disease caused by this particular agent? All right, so that's what we discussed. So in large sense, this is going to be useful to anybody and everybody who's watching the video here. Right, so Vibrio parahemolyticus infection. All right, Vibrio parahemolyticus infection, I had mentioned this earlier. The etiological agent is Vibrio parahemolyticus. So it goes by the name Vibrio parahemolyticus. This is a salt-loving organism. All right, so they are halophilic. If I may be more specific in microbiological terms, we call them as halophilic. Halophilic organisms are those that are salt loving. They can tolerate very high concentration of salt. So you can actually relate, they are commonly found in seafoods. Very commonly found in seafoods. So the salinity that is present in marine water, you can understand. So these are the organisms that can survive that amount of salinity. So that's why we call them as halophilic. Right. So Vibrio parahemolyticus, the incubation period may vary from 2 to 48 hours. It depends. It depends on many factors. It may depend on the incubation period, always depends on the dosage. Dosage, when I say the load of the pathogenic organism or the etiological agent that you are consuming along with the food that is going inside your body immune system. How potent is your body immune system in fighting against these pathogenic organisms, and then how much the microorganism is able to fight against your immune system and then start multiplying and start showing up the pathological reactions. So that is basically the incubation time. So it takes a little bit of time for the infectious agent to start behaving the way it does. So it initially it will have to fight with the immune system of the host. So that is the incubation period. So it's between 22 to 48 hours, usually 12 hours. That's what they say. And what are the symptoms? So what do the symptoms start up with? It starts up with, okay, that's what the symptoms, the initial symptoms is what we're discussing here about. As the cases gets more and more adverse, all right, the symptoms may vary. There can be different organ involvements that we are not going to be discussing about here. We are not medical practitioners, but we need to understand basically if there are symptoms of these sort, what we need to really understand, and how do we need to address the issue. Right. So abdominal pain, it's common to all foodborne infections. Abdominal pain and diarrhea, watery stools containing blood and mucus. Now that is something rare. You may have diarrhea, that may be very common. All right, especially in the developing countries, diarrheal conditions are pretty normal. If there's a diarrheal condition, in most cases the patient doesn't even take the case to the doctor. He just pops up a tablet, and he's done with it. The motion gets arrested, and then he's done with it. He's not concerned about going or consulting a medical practitioner. That's how things happen. But then, yeah, we need to understand if the diarrheal condition is watery and is mixed with mucus and blood, then it's not a normal simple diarrhea. That could be because of any common pathogen. You need to be really careful. It could be Vibrio parahemolyticus, and if you don't attend to the case as early as possible, it may take you to a difficult situation. All right, now usually nausea and vomiting, they are all typical symptoms that are coupled with the foodborne diseases. Nausea is the feeling of vomiting, and then that's coupled with vomiting. Mild fever, chills, headache, prostration, recovery within 2 to 5 days. All right, provided the immune system is strong enough and the treatment is on. So the recovery takes anywhere between 2 to 5 days. So this is what the symptoms are all about. And if a patient is suffering through these symptoms or showing up these symptoms, it's better to consult a healthcare practitioner. The earliest, the better. Foods involved, as I had already mentioned, raw foods of marine origin. All right, seafoods basically that we're referring to: saltwater fish, shellfish, crustaceans, and fish products. So all of them, crabs, lobsters, and etc., etc., all from marine sources. They are the main carriers because these organisms are highly salt tolerant, and so they are commonly found in seafoods. Now, what are the control measures? In the control measures, there's a thumb rule. What we need to understand is a simple thumb rule as far as food safety is concerned. If you want to control the microbiological risk, microbiological hazards, pathogens in food, the thumb rule is you cook the food and ensure the core temperature, the internal temperature of the food is about 72 degrees Celsius. If you keep that as a thumb rule, then you can consider any food that you treat that way safe for consumption. All right. So this is the thumb rule. So cooking is the thumb rule, and that will eliminate almost all food safety related issues that are concerned with microbial contamination, microbial risk. All right. So that's one, and that's the most fundamental. Besides that, you have issues relating to equipment and personal hygiene. Personal hygiene, of course, in this case may not be so relevant, but then cross contamination. When I say cross contamination, contamination being carried forward from one surface to the other surface. So if you're handling a fish, seafood, you're using a chopping board, the chopping board to chop the raw material, and if you're using this same chopping board to chop another raw material, another fish, it's always better that you ensure that before every use the chopping board or the surface that is coming in contact with the food is sanitized. All right. So sanitization is basically done in the industrial scale. The most simplest method that is advised is using 100 ppm chlorine water, where you wash whatever contact surface, clean them, wipe clean them, and then spray or sanitize them with 100 ppm chlorine water and allow them to dry. All right, allow them to air dry. That is the simplest method of doing it. So if you do that, you'd be able to a large extent control cross contamination. But then to kill and eradicate and make the food safe, cooking to 72 degrees Celsius is always essential. All right. So this is about Vibrio parahimalicus, the first one. The second one is EPEC. I had mentioned in the last lecture that E. coli is not an organism. Not all categories of E. coli, not all types of E. coli cause the illness or the support type of symptoms that they generally show. Some of the E. coli may be normal flora of human intestine of some individuals, that may be possible, but then this particular type, which is called as the enteropathogenic E. coli, EPEC, what is referred to as, it causes diarrheal and intestinal disorders. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. So E. coli, both enterotoxigenic and invasive strains cause illness. So enterotoxigenic, all right, and enteropathogenic, they are strains that can cause illness in case of human infection, right? So what's the incubation period? Incubation period may vary between 8 to 24 hours in case of invasive type, where the organism invades through the tissues. That's what they mean. Invasive type, it may be between 8 to 24 hours, and the average you can take about 11 hours. Okay, so 11 hours you can always expect that the symptoms may show up, incubation time. In case of enterotoxigenic, where toxins are released by the organism inside the intestine after you consume, invasion is the microbe trying to invade the tissue cells, right? The tissues around. And enterotoxigenic means it refers to release of toxins by the microorganism once it is consumed, right? Now that is enterotoxicity. So in such cases, the incubation time may vary between 8 to 44 hours. Okay, that's longer because the release of toxin requires a specified condition. So the microorganism takes its own sweet time to release the toxin. And in case of invasive illness, what are the symptoms that may generally show up? It may start with fever, chills, headache, myalgia, abdominal cramps, profuse watery diarrhea. All right. So you'll see in most of the cases, the symptoms more or less appear the same. There may be variations here and there, And that's why it's always important that the diagnosis, the earlier it is done, the always better. Right. So if you start showing up symptoms that are turning out to be really adverse, it is always better not to get into self-medication, rather approach a medical practitioner, healthcare practitioner, to get yourself treated the right way. All right. So that is for invasive illness. In case of enterotoxigenic illness, it may start with diarrhea. So the diarrhea is a typical appearance, right? The stool appears rice water stool. You know? It's like once you do when you cook rice, you get the starchy water coming out. So it's white liquid that is coming out. So if you find that if you stool appears to be that way, with this whitish in color or sort of transparent, translucent type of diarrhea, then it's always better. You could it could be to diagnose that it could be enterotoxigenic E. coli infection, vomiting, dehydration, shock, toxic shock, similar to cholera. So the symptoms may be very close to cholera. So it is always confused. All right. So these are the basically symptoms that show up and the incubation period. Now, what are the foods generally involved? Now, three main sources that they are saying. These are all based on the epidemiological survey data that is available. Okay, for more information on stuff like this, it's always better for you to visit the websites of CDC, Center for Disease Control Atlanta. They are very informative on these. So there are a lot of information about such infections on the website there that you can always look up to. Right now, so coffee substitutes, any substitute used in place of coffee can carry the germ E. coli. So it's a very common source. Salmon fish, that's what they are referring to. And then cheese. So cheese is also a common carrier of this pathogen. Now, what or how we do the management of this disease, how do we control, is what we need to understand. Chill foods rapidly in small quantities. Right. So the moment if you're cooking the food, it is also equally important to chill the food if you're going to be storing it for a long period of time. If it is not going to be consumed then and there, it is always better to chill the food as rapidly as possible and bring down the temperature below 5 degrees within a shortest period of time. So in industrial scale, what generally people do is they use blast chillers to bring down the temperature from 72 degrees Celsius above, because that's the temperature that we'll be taking the food to, above 72 degrees Celsius, and then you rapidly try to bring it down to below 5 degrees Celsius. That is generally done using blast chillers. Okay, so the time period required for the food to chill down is shortened as much as possible. The reason is you try and avoid to keep food in something called as the danger zone, the danger temperature zone. So the danger temperature zone can vary anywhere between 5 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius, right? So I'm just giving you an approximate range, temperature range of between 15 degrees Celsius. It's not 5 degrees, it's 15 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. In this temperature zone, okay, it is not preferred, it is not advised that the food should be kept in this temperature zone for a long period of time. Once the food is kept in this period of this temperature for a long period of time, you can assume that if there is a pathogenic organism contaminating the food, they are going to rapidly multiply in this temperature zone and their microbial load is going to double, or maybe they're going to multiply in log fashion into I would say n number of scale. It's very difficult for me to put it across here in the shortest way possible, but then it's always simplest to understand is it's always better not to keep food in the temperature zone of between 15 degrees Celsius to 45 degrees Celsius if you're going to keep the food for a long period of time. Now, so chilling is an essential aspect. Cook food thoroughly. This will always going to be showing up in every aspect that we discuss, every disease that we discuss. Cooking food thoroughly is something which is absolutely essential. Okay, so I said that's the thumb rule. Okay, and then personal hygiene practices, yes, because I must tell you, in food industry, more than equipments or the raw material, the most dangerous source of contamination is the handling staff themselves. Okay, which we the ones who are handling the food are more responsible for contaminating the food than anything else. So we need to be very cautious about our hygiene habits, personal hygiene habits. Prepare foods in sanitary manner as much as possible in the most hygienic condition. If you try to prepare food, you try and avoid cross contamination, entry of any sort of pathogen. That's essential. Protect and treat water. Now this is again another aspect which is generally ignored. If you happen to be dining outside anywhere, then you will be pretty sure of what is the water that is being used, what is the quality of water that is being used for cooking there in that outlet. Because I'm referring to Indian standards here. As per Indian standards, any food establishment, water to be used in any food processing or food catering establishments, the quality of water, irrespective of what the usage or what the application could be, it could be for washing hands, it could be for washrooms, it could be for washing equipments, washing vegetables, whatever be the case. If there is supply of water into your food processing facility, that is, which is obviously a requirement, unavoidable requirement, then it is absolutely essential that the water should be a potable standard. Okay, this is also an Indian standard. It refers to what potable standard means. That is IS 10 500, IS 10500. That's a standard that all food establishments are supposed to maintain as far as the water is concerned, that is going to be put to use in your food establishments. All right, so water, treated water, is absolutely essential because that is one major source that is going to carry microorganisms or the foodborne pathogens into your food. All right. 10. Disposal of sewage in sanitary manner. All right, you need to ensure that waste disposal has been properly scheduled, programmed, planned, and implemented in your food establishment facility. That is absolutely essential. Okay, that also becomes another source of contamination, and that needs to be avoided. So these are all control measures that could be adopted in order to avoid contamination by E. coli. All right, then comes Bacillus cereus. Okay, now as I mentioned, if you remember in my previous lecture, Bacillus I mentioned is a genus which is known to be sporulating. They are spore formers and they are extremely tolerant to heat. The spores of these the species within the genus Bacillus extremely tolerant to heat. All right, so you can expect that the species Bacillus cereus, if you are referring to in particular, they will be commonly found in food that have been heat treated, but not adequately heat treated. All right, you may heat treat food. Say for example, you heat treat lentils. You make lentil soup, what you call as dal or sambar or whatever here in the Indian scenario. So if you're going to be preparing lentil soup and the heat that has been provided, the heat treatment that has been provided is not adequate enough, it may kill the other pathogens, but the species of Bacillus cereus, okay, they are going to sporulate, they are going to form spores. Spores are extremely heat resistant forms. All right, so they will be there in your food, and when the conditions become favorable again, they will come back to their vegetative form and start multiplying. All right, so that's the risk involved in Bacillus cereus. So Bacillus cereus gastroenteritis. All right, so this is the next kind of disease that we're going to be talking about, and the etiological agent is Bacillus cereus itself. The Bacillus cereus, again, in the last lecture we discussed, there are two, I had mentioned only of one, where I spoke of the diarrheogenic toxin. Diarrheogenic is toxin where the bacteria is consumed along with the food. It goes inside your system, and inside your body, it starts releasing the toxin that causes the ailment. There is another category which is basically the emetic syndrome kind of situation, where the toxin is released in the food. That is basically intoxication. That is not infection. That is basically intoxication, where the toxin is released into the food, and the food is, when consumed along with the toxin, is going to cause the damage that it does. All right, so there are two categories of Bacillus cereus infection that we are referring to here. So let us first address the diarrheal type of infection, diarrheal syndrome. The incubation period as shown here takes 8 to 16 hours, or maybe 1 to 5 hours in some cases. Okay, it could be more depending on the load of the microorganism that is being taken along with the food. Now, The symptoms are typical. I wouldn't say typical, it is common: nausea, abdominal cramps, watery diarrhea, and sometimes vomiting. So you see, most of these symptoms are common to all of the foodborne infections, right? That's obvious, because the site of action is going to be the intestinal tract, then the abdominal cavity, then the symptoms are going to be more or less the same, right? So let's now see the types of food involved: custard, cereal products, pudding, sauces, meatloaves. Okay, so you can imagine all of them basically food that undergoes some sort of heat treatment at some part of their processing stage. All right, so custards, cereal products, puddings, sauces, meatloaves. It could also be because the raw material that is being added into making these products. All right, so that is the foods involved. How do we ensure that we can control the spread of Bacillus cereus? Chill the food rapidly in small quantities. Again, why we always refer to in small quantities? Because large quantities is going to take a longer time to chill. Okay, if you're going to be taking larger volume, and if you're going to be using a deep vessel, I would say generally in the industrial scale we always use a shallow pan to do the chilling, because the surface area is more, the heat exchange is faster, and the food gets chilled faster. So that's why we use shallow pans. We don't use deep utensils to chill when we need to chill them, and we use them in we chill them in smaller quantities, because the time taken for the food to chill down is faster. All right, so the chilling happens faster, the time is shorter. Right now, cold hot foods at 65 degrees Celsius or above. So I have mentioned 72 degrees Celsius. Now they are referring to 65 degrees Celsius. But again, it all depends on the sensory quality of the food that you want to maintain. So if you want to maintain the sensory quality of the food, you should always be careful about the amount of heat treatment that you are giving to the food. All right. So 65 degrees Celsius is absolutely essential. In any case, practice personal hygiene. Again, this is another important aspect. Personal hygiene: process and prepare food in sanitary manner. Reheat leftover foods to 72 degrees Celsius. So if you're going to be chilling the food, and if you're going to be consuming it again, if you want to consume it hot, then you ensure that reheating is done to 72 degrees Celsius again. Because when you chill the food, all right, Bacillus cereus, again, it is a condition not being favorable. They're going to form spores, and if you don't kill the spores, they're going to germinate and get back to vegetative form and start multiplying. So what you need to do in order to kill the heat resistant spores, you take the temperature back to 72 degrees Celsius at least, to ensure that all the microbial load present, especially the pathogenic microbial present in the food, are heat killed. Now coming back to the emetic type of toxin released, or emetic syndrome by Bacillus cereus, the incubation period may be 1 to 6 hours. So it is very short. Remember, this is intoxication. This is not infection. You are not consuming the organism. Even if you do consume the organism, it is not the organism that is causing the damage, but the toxin that has been released by the organism into the food that you are consuming along with the food is what is going to cause the damage. So the reaction is going to be much more faster, rapid as compared to the diarrheal. So in diarrheal cases, it is more, the time period is more, and in case of intoxication, it is 1 to 6 hours. Emetic condition is intoxication, it is just 1 to 6 hours. In most cases it could be 2 to 5 hours also. So it is within few hours the symptoms will start showing up. Most common: nausea and vomiting predominant. Okay, similar to staphylococcal intoxication, short duration, 1 day or less. So in most cases of, in almost I would say all cases of intoxication, the clinical condition, or the medical condition the patient goes through, disappears on its own. Just a mild treatment would be required until unless the situation turns out to be really watery diarrhea and you're losing liquids from your body, you're getting dehydrated. It's a different case altogether. But these are conditions that are self-limiting, because the microorganism does not multiply in your body. They are just releasing a little bit of toxin that into the food, and that little bit of toxin you're consuming, that shows up results. And then the moment the toxin has been taken care of in your body, or it gets diluted, these symptoms start to dilute and fade away. So that's what happens in intoxication, cases of intoxication. So as I mentioned, fried rice, mashed potatoes, vegetable sprouts, so they are typically loaded with Bacillus cereus. All right, so they are the foods that you need to be very careful when you consume. All right. Now, the next type of bacterial infection that we are referring to is shigellosis. All right, shigellosis is basically called as bacillary dysentery. There are two types of dysentery medically that we talk of: amoebic dysentery and bacillary dysentery. Amoebic dysentery is caused by Entamoeba histolytica. That's protozoan that we'll be talking of in the later half of our lecture. Maybe if not in this lecture, maybe the next lecture, the next sequencing lecture. But we'll talk about Shigellary dysentery here, your bacillary dysentery here. It's caused by a group of genus called the Shigella. Okay, and within Shigella there are different species: Shigella soni, Shigella flexneri, Shigella dysentery, and Shigella body. So we have 4 different species within the same genus that can cause shigellosis. All right, bacillary dysentery. Now, what is the incubation time? 1 to 7 days. It may take between 1 to 7 days for the symptoms to show up. Now, in most cases of infection, foodborne infection, what happens is to identify the source of infection. All right, to investigate and identify the source of infection is very, very typical, because in most cases the patient doesn't even realize the food that has caused him the damage, that is the food that has put him to trouble, because he has consumed the food, he has digested it, it is off his memory, he doesn't remember what he consumed. It may have been a week old food that he consumed that has caused the damage today, the symptoms are showing up today. I may have had the food last Saturday. All right, so it depends, because in most cases of infection it is very, very difficult to investigate, because the incubation periods could be longer. So 1 to 7 days is the incubation period. Usually 4 days is absolutely normal. Okay, so 4 days you can actually not come back and say that it's because of the food that I consumed there, or because of the food that I consumed at my friend's place, I'm having diarrhea now. No, it is very difficult to investigate such cases. So if they are extremely variable, so of course the symptoms are extremely variable, that's what I'm referring to here. Mild to severe symptoms: abdominal cramps, all right, typical, that's common. Fever, chills, diarrhea, watery stool is common. Frequently containing blood, mucus, or pus. Now, blood and mucus we mentioned here, we discussed here. Blood and mucus here was Vibrio parahemolyticus that we discussed here. But then here in this case, we are referring to pus as well. Now, what is pus? Pus is the whitish fluid, which is a mixture of the bacterial load, the dead cells of our body, and the exudates, the bacterial exudate or the tissue exudates. They put together, they form something called as the pus. So the pus may also be seen along with the stool. Okay, along with blood and mucus, pus could also be seen. In such cases, it's difficult, right? You need to immediately get to the doctor as early as possible. Tenesmus, headache, lassitude, prostration, nausea, dehydration, they are all the types of symptoms that generally show up. Right. Now, what are the types of food that generally carry the pathogen here? Now, moist and mixed food, all right. Assume where mostly the contamination by Shigella is either through water or through raw material. We need to be very clear about that. So moist or mixed food: milk, beans, potato, tuna, shrimps, turkey, macaroni, salads, apple cider, and I guess it's pork. No, I'm sorry about that. I'm not able to read it out. But the foods are typical. The ones that have moisture content good enough, and it all depends on the raw material and the source of water that has been used for preparation. Now, how do we control this? Practicing personal hygiene. Good amount of personal hygiene needs to be practiced. Chill foods rapidly in small quantities. They are all repetitive. Prepare food in sanitary manner. Again, maintain as much as possible food hygiene. Cook foods thoroughly. Again, protect and treat water. All right. This again will appear over and over again. Generally, when we do testing of food, screening for pathogens, we tend to ignore, the beginners at least tend to ignore the importance and necessity of testing the water that is being used in the food processing facility. That is absolutely essential. We need to do that. Then disposal of waste and in the sanitary way possible. Controlling pests, especially flies. Now, this is something which is going to add on, because flies generally tend to carry you know where flies sit upon. It's not just the food that we eat, but also something that we excrete. So for flies, both of it are common. So they're going to carry the germs from excreta to what we eat. All right, what we excrete to what we eat, it is going to be carried by the flies. So we need to ensure that we have the good or the best pest control measures possible in our food processing facility or our kitchens. Next comes Yersiniosis. Yersiniosis again is caused by Yersinia enterocolitica or Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. So there are two species that can cause Yersiniosis. The incubation period is comparatively shorter, between 24 to 36 hours. Within a day or two, you would show up. It can be longer at times, but in most cases, between 24 to 36 hours. Within 2 days, the symptoms would show up. Abdominal pain suggesting acute appendicitis. So you can imagine the pain is going to be at a different position. It's going to be sharp. It is going to be acute at a particular region. So it may show up. It may be at times falsely diagnosed by the patients themselves as appendicitis, but that may not be the case. That could be infection because of Yersiniosis. Fever, headache, malaise, anorexia, diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, chills, pharyngitis, infection in your pharynges, leukocytosis, erythema nodosum. So they are all typical symptoms that are associated with Yersiniosis. So what are the food that is basically involved? Pork and meat. Okay, pork and meat products, raw milk, or any contaminated raw or leftover food. So raw or leftover food, if you're going to be, it is always that way. It is always mentioned. I always been propagating that, not being very biased on that, but in the Indian food system, we always cook everything and anything. It may be in a way, I would say loss of nutrition may happen by too much of cooking, but then the food is always safe to consume. That is something that we need to keep in mind. So leftover foods, consumption of leftover food as much as possible needs to be avoided, and consuming cooked food is always better and is always safer. Cook foods thoroughly, protect foods from contamination, control rodents. Rodents here means when we talk of rats and mice, we are talking of them. So we have to have good pest control measures in order to control Yersiniosis specifically. We must be reminded that Yersinia pestis, okay, is the organism that causes plague. Okay, and again that is also carried forward through the carrier organism is basically a rodent. So you should be able to relate that. Now, Arizona infection, Arizona Hindavi, okay, that is not discussed much, at least in the Asian context or in the Indian subcontinent. This is not a scenario that is common, not discussed much, but still 2 to 4 hours of incubation, usually within 2 to 46 hours of incubation, within 24 hours the symptoms show up. Abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, chills, headache, weakness, fever lasts a few days. Okay, now it is again a self-limiting kind of a infection that may be easily controlled. What are the types of food? Okay, now if you look at the type of food, that describes what this is not much very commonly found in the Indian subcontinent or the Asian side. Consumption of turkey. All right, so turkey consumption is not very common in the Indian subcontinent or in the Asian subcontinent. Maybe in the eastern side of the Asian world, it may be prevalent, but then consumption of turkey is not very common. Cream-filled pastry, okay, pastry consumption has gained momentum of late in the Indian subcontinent, but then that is not very rampant. Custard containing eggs, all right, maybe because of the egg usage, the source of contamination could be egg. That's why specifically it's mentioned here. So egg containing custard may be a carrier of the etiological layer Arizona Javi. Right, now chill foods rapidly in small quantities, that's how we control. Cook foods thoroughly, prevent fecal contamination. Okay, prevent fecal contamination. Yeah, so Yeah, so chilling foods, coming back to how we can prevent Arizona infection, chilling foods rapidly, again, the same set of instructions to prevent the contamination from happening, as much as possible, avoid cross contamination, prevent fecal contamination, and avoid cross contamination from raw to cooked food, sanitize equipments, reheat leftovers thoroughly. So they're all basically normal norms of food safety that we need to adhere to. That's what we are referring to here. All right. Then comes the most uncommon beta hemolytic streptococcal infection. All right. The streptococcal infection in most cases is always related to throat infection. All right, so it is related to throat infection. So when I say beta hemolytic, it's complete hemolysis of blood. Okay, there are variants of streptococci, alpha hemolytic and beta hemolytic. Now we are referring specifically to beta hemolytic streptococci here, that can lyse blood cells. It's a type of identifying mechanism to refer to as beta hemolytic streptococci. That's where referred to. That is basically Streptococcus pyogenes. Streptococcus pyogenes is the organism that we refer to as beta hemolytic streptococci. All right. So the symptoms can show up. The incubation period between 1 to 3 days. Symptoms can show up in 3 days' time. It starts with sore throat or the red throat. So the infection is confined to the throat here. Tonsillitis, high fever, headache, nausea, vomiting. So typical of what you experience during a sore throat is what is mentioned here. All right. The common sources: milk, ice creams, eggs, steamed lobster, potato salad, egg salad, custard and pudding, foods usually containing egg or milk. So they are the most common sources of streptococcal infection, or carry forward the streptococcal load into through food into your throat. So how do we manage this? Chilling, personal hygiene, cooking, pasteurizing milk, exclude workers with respiratory illness or skin infection. So this is another subject that is generally discussed in food industry. It is always advised not to include or involve uh, employees into handling food ones who complain of medical ailments such as abdominal discomfort, diarrhea, cough and cold. Some people that employees who show up such symptoms are generally kept away from the food processing or food contact areas, so that they don't become the source of infection and they don't carry forward the infection. So this much we have discussed about the bacterial foodborne diseases in specific. We are not discussed here about Staphylococcus aureus intoxication. I would mention in short about Staphylococcus aureus infection. Staphylococcus aureus infection, as I had mentioned in the earlier lecture, in the earlier video, is basically intoxication. So food getting contaminated of Staphylococcus aureus generally, if not kept under the appropriate condition, I mean, if not kept in cold condition or not heated properly, and too much of handling, what happens? The contamination load of the food increases, and as it increases, the population density of Staphylococcus aureus increases multifold, and when it reaches a stage where the number of cells, the count of cells per gram of the food is more than 1 million, in such cases, the Staphylococcus aureus releases enterotoxin. It's an exotoxin. It is released into the food, and when you consume that enterotoxin along with the food, then it causes the intoxication that generally shows up in a few hours, maybe within 3 to 6 hours. The symptoms show up, and the symptoms are very typical to any sort of infection that you see in here: nausea, vomiting, headache, fever, and at times maybe diarrhea. Diarrhea may not necessarily show up, but this is typical of Staphylococcus aureus infection. And common food that involve a lot of handling. So you can I would the most common example is sandwiches that are generally used, sandwiches with raw or semi-processed fillings, cream based products, pastries. They are very simple or common examples of food that are involved in carrying forward staphylococcal infection, intoxication. Control measures: Personal hygiene, I would say I would rate it as the most important aspect as far as Staphylococcus aureus infection is concerned. After personal hygiene, heating the food and chilling the food. So they are the two most important, the three most important. And after that, you could also consider sanitizing the equipment or the handling surface, the contact surfaces, wherever the food is likely to get in contact with. And that's it. So if you are able to manage all of this, you should be able to manage Staphylococcal aureus intoxication. All right. Now, this is all about bacterial diseases, foodborne diseases, but it is not limited only to what has been discussed here. There could be more to it. There is definitely more to it. The tabulation here shows in concise form what we could expect. The tabulation does not discuss of Clostridium botulinum specifically. It doesn't discuss of Clostridium perfringens. It doesn't discuss of Salmonella typhi, typhoid infection. So there are many more to be discussed. But then you could always refer to these by visiting these websites of CDC. I would always recommend CDC, Center for Disease Control, Atlanta. The public portal of the institution is very informative, and the language uses simple and understandable to any commoner who wants to understand more on foodborne infections and foodborne illness. So for today, I will end up here for this video. Thank you so much. The next video we will be continuing with mycotoxins and protozoal and helminthic foodborne infections. Thank you so much. That's all for today.